Hi, I'm JD Ramirez. Thanks for checking out part 4 of the Almighty God magazine titled Top 10 Reasons We Know the New Testament Authors Told the Truth. So I encourage you to please like, subscribe, comment, and share on this video so that we might get it out to more people. So in this article, the top 10 reasons we know the New Testament authors told the truth, it's pretty much a summary of Dr. Turek and Geisler's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist, chapter 11. So let's dig right into the points that they bring forth. First one is the New Testament writers include embarrassing details about themselves. This principle of embarrassment assumes that any details that's embarrassing to the author is probably true because the authors tend to leave out anything that makes them look bad. If you and your friends were creating a false religion and you wanted to make yourselves look like dim-witted, uncaring, rebuking, doubting cowards, I don't think so. But this is what the writers of the New Testament did. They were shown to be dim-witted, falling asleep and failing to understand what Jesus was saying in Mark 9, Luke 18, and John 12. They were shown to be uncaring as they fell asleep on Jesus twice when they were asked to pray the night Jesus was taken to be crucified, and the disciples failed to give Jesus a proper burial out of fear for themselves. Jesus was buried by a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin, a member of the same court that sentenced him to die. They were rebuked. Peter was called Satan by Jesus in Mark 8. Paul corrects Peter on theological and sinful issues in Galatians 2. Keep in mind that Peter is one of the pillars of the early church, and Paul is honest about the sin for all to see. They are cowards in the New Testament. All the disciples but one hide while Jesus dies on the cross. Peter denies Jesus 3 times in Matthew 26, while the brave men are hiding, while the women discover the tomb of Jesus. They're shown to be doubters. Despite being taught that Jesus would rise from the dead in John 2 and John 3, Matthew 12, 17, and 20, verses 22 through 23, the disciples were doubtful when they hear of his resurrection. Some even doubt when they see him risen in Matthew 28. Number 2, the New Testament writers abandoned their long-held sacred beliefs and practices and adopted new ones that they did not deny under testimony of persecution or threat of death. New Testament writers don't just say Jesus performed miracles and rose from the dead, they back it up with actions of their own. Virtually overnight, they abandoned many long-held and sacred beliefs of Judaism. For example, animal sacrifice was replaced with the sacrifice of Christ. The law of Moses no longer held power because the sinless life of Christ. They now worship Jesus as the God-man, considered by the Jews to be blasphemous and punishable by death, and believing in a sacrificial Messiah versus the conquering Messiah. Not only were just the New Testament writers converted, but thousands from Jerusalem, including Pharisees, followed Christ. History shows that within 5 weeks of the death and resurrection of Jesus, more than 10,000 Jews converted to Christianity. How can this be explained if the resurrection did not occur? These converts also adopted new radical practices such as Sunday worship, baptism, and communion as signs of Christ's sacrifice. New Testament writers had nothing to gain by trying to pull off a hoax. The only worldly reward they received was persecution and death. New Testament writers could have saved themselves by confessing it was all a lie, but they never did. If they had made up the resurrection story, certainly they would have said so when they were about to be crucified like Peter, or stoned like James, or beheaded like Paul. But no one recanted. 11 out of the 12 apostles were martyred for their faith. Why would any sane person die for a known lie? Don't forget that all 12 claimed to be eyewitnesses of Jesus' resurrection, and they would have known if the resurrection was reality or not. The apostles knew for sure that Jesus had been resurrected, and they demonstrated that knowledge with their own blood. Number 3, enemies and critics of Christianity confirm the basic storyline as the New Testament writers present in the Bible. Josephus, a Jewish historian for the Roman government, writes in AD 94, At this time there was a wise man called Jesus, and his conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. Pilate condemned him to be crucified and die. But those who had become disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he appeared to them 3 days after his crucifixion and was alive. Accordingly, perhaps he was the Messiah, concerning whom the prophets reported wonders. And the tribe of Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. This is the Paul Meyer translation. Josephus also writes, Then James, the brother of Jesus, who was called the Christ, was stoned to death by the Sanhedrin in the absence of the Roman governor. Would you be willing to die for your brother if he claimed to be the sinless Son of God and the Savior of the world? James was willing to die in the name of Christ because he saw that Jesus lived a blameless life and he witnessed his resurrection from the dead. The Talmud is a Jewish history book written by the Jewish authorities between AD 70 and 200 that confirms when, how, and why they killed Jesus. In Sanhedrin 43a it states, On the eve of Passover, Yeshua, who is Jesus, was hanged. He has practiced sorcery and enticed Israel to apostasy. This tells us that Jesus was killed on Passover, had supernatural powers, and he was calling people to follow him. Number 4, New Testament writers left in demanding sayings of Jesus. If the New Testament writers were making up the story, they should have made up a story that made life a little easier on them. For example, the New Testament claims Jesus said, quote, Anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart, in Matthew 5:28. Do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also, in Matthew chapter 5. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Those are just to name a few. These are not commands the New Testament writers would impose on themselves because no mere human can live up to that standard. Number 5. The New Testament writers carefully distinguished Jesus' words from their own. Quotation marks did not exist in first century Greek, but the New Testament writers clearly distinguished between Jesus' words and their own. Virtually all red letter editions of the Bible attribute the same words to Jesus. This is important evidence towards the credibility of the New Testament writers because it would have been easy for them to solve theological disputes just by adding to the sayings of Jesus. It would have been easy to make up quotes in relation to circumstances and obeying the laws of Moses, speaking in tongues, and women in the church in order to end all the debates. Why were the New Testament writers so careful about distinguishing their own words from the words of Jesus unless they were telling the truth? Number 6. The New Testament writers include events related to the resurrection that they would not have made up. For instance, the burial of Jesus. Jesus was buried by Joseph of Arimathea. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish ruling council that sentenced Jesus to die for blasphemy. Followers of Jesus were very bitter towards the Jewish authorities, so why would they put a member of the Sanhedrin in a favorable light if the story was made up? Furthermore, if Jesus wasn't really buried by Joseph of Arimathea, this detail could have been easily exposed, making Luke out to be a liar and his gospel a fake. Next, the first witnesses. All 4 gospels say women were the first witnesses to see the empty tomb and the resurrected Jesus. In that day, women were not seen as credible witnesses and were not even allowed to testify in a court. One of the women was Mary Magdalene, who Luke admits in chapter 8 was once a demon-possessed woman. These are not the kind of witnesses you would make up if the New Testament authors were trying to fool the world. Next, the conversion of priests. Why didn't the risen Jesus appear to the Pharisees? Maybe they were too proud and it wasn't necessary. It's often overlooked that, quote, a large number of priests became obedient to the faith, end quote, in Acts chapter 6, verse 7. This was written in Luke's letter to Theophilus in the book of Acts. This detail must have been true because this detail could have been easily exposed as false if it were false. Next, the explanation of the Jews. The Jews want people to believe that the cowardly disciples stole the body and created a story of the resurrection, all in order to get themselves beaten, tortured, and martyred? If this were true, how did the disciples get past the Roman guards who were trained to protect the tomb with their lives? The Jews said the guards were sleeping when the disciples moved a 2-ton stone from the grave. If the guards were sleeping, how would they know the disciples stole the body? Furthermore, no Roman guard would admit to sleeping on the job because he would be killed for the offense. Maybe the biblical story in Matthew is true. The Pharisees created this bad story, paid off the guards, and promised to keep them out of trouble. Number 7. The New Testament writers include more than 30 historically confirmed people in their writings. The New Testament could not have been invented because it contains too many historically confirmed characters. The New Testament writers have blown their credibility with their audiences by implicating real people in a fictional story, especially people of great notoriety and power. The New Testament writers would not have gotten away with publicly telling lies about Pilate, Caiaphas, Festus, Felix, and the entire Herodian bloodline. Number 8. The New Testament writers include divergent details. The 4 gospel accounts are not exactly the same. Critics say this proves it's a lie, but actually it strengthens the case for the biblical story of Christ. All 4 gospels tell the same main storyline: the virgin birth, miracle worker, Son of God, raised from the dead, but each account includes divergent details. Think of it like this. A judge hears 4 stories that are exactly the same word for word. He would probably assume the witnesses got together beforehand to make the stories agree. This is called collusion. The gospel accounts differ on small details like how many angels were in the tomb, or one account says an angel spoke and another said didn't even mention it. Just because one account mentions one angel does not mean there were not more. Maybe just one was more prominent. The New Testament shows the nature of eyewitness testimony. I challenge you to read 2 news articles about the same event. It will usually be the same main storyline with some differing minor details. Number 9. The New Testament writers challenge their readers to check out verifiable facts, even about miracles. For example, in Paul's second letter to the Corinthians, he declares that he previously performed miracles for them. Paul was speaking of his own qualifications as an apostle, someone who speaks of God, for God. Paul told the Corinthians that these things were a mark of apostleship, signs and wonders and miracles, and they were done among you with great perseverance in 2 Corinthians 12:12. Paul would not have written this unless he had really done these miracles for them. Why would you have asked the Corinthians to remember miracles that he did not perform, thus destroying his credibility? The only explanation is that Paul was an apostle of God, and he confirmed it by miracles and openly displayed this to the Corinthians. And number 10, New Testament writers describe miracles like other historical events, simple and unembellished. Embellished and extravagant details are strong signs that a historical account may be fraudulent. For example, 100 years after the resurrection of Jesus, a forgery known as the Gospel of Peter was written in an extravagant manner. The Gospel of Peter speaks of long heads reaching up to heaven and a cross that walked and talked at the time of Jesus' resurrection. In the 4 Gospel accounts in the Bible, there are no extravagant details or embellished stories, just bland facts about the greatest miracle in history. If the gospel were fake and they were trying to convince skeptics, don't you think that they would have claimed to have actually seen Jesus physically rising from the dead and maybe thrown in a few extra adjectives to help? 35 other miracles are attributed to Jesus and described as if from reporters, not wild-eyed preachers. Check out Dr. Frank Turek's website at crossexamine.org, and also take the time to like and share and subscribe this video. Thank you for watching.